Wonderful. And the other Kathy?
There's two more.
Kathy Lundeen and I decided that we did paper, rock, scissors, and I won. So I'm Kathy Lovelace. I'm a professor of management at Menlo College. And Sarah and I were doctoral students together. So go UMass Amherst. Okay, you have to add that other part there. And I'm here to support Sarah. She always has interesting, provocative things to say. And I'm really excited about your session.
Thank you. I forgot that there was another Kathy.
Yeah,
Kathy Lundeen.
I think there are at least three.
There's
So
a
I'm
Captain
Kathy
over
Lundeen.
it.
I'm at Gustavus Adolphus College in Minnesota, outside the Twin Cities, and I teach all kinds of management courses. I'm hearing a lot of sort of utility infielder sort of roles that we have. But I'm very interested in this session. I teach the business ethics course, and like many of the people have already responded, moving away from the bottom line focus is a core learning objective from the course. And I cannot get my undergraduate students to read The Wealth of Nations, where the capitalism—
An excerpt.
like Adam Smith was worried about everything that's happening, and he wrote it in the first set of chapters.
Yep.
Yeah.
But, right, so, and in my role, I engage with a lot of our alumni, and I supervise 3 students who sit on our Board of Trustees level investment committee that manages the endowment. And one of those members, I have coffee with them a lot, and one of the members said to me, "Can you please talk about capitalism in a way that's not terrible?"
Great.
I said, "Well, Paul, it would be great if you guys helped us out." So there is a toggle at my institution where we're a faith-based institution. We are the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the good one that loves everybody.
Me too.
So we are faith-based, and yet we are conflicted about some of the messages that we get about business. And so I'm quite interested to hear what you have to say. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's see, Nicole?
Hi there, how are you? So I am an associate professor of management, also at Menlo College, where Kathy teaches. And what I'd like to learn a little bit more about the session is your views about capitalism in terms of, how we can see it as being advantageous or not. I currently am working on a business and society piece. We just got published in blog with 2 other co-authors of mine, where we compare different kinds of sociological frameworks. I'm going to be extending that piece, looking at, let's say, the Marxist argument, how business schools need to be redesigned around opportunity gap reduction, obviously collapse of, social conflict among class-based systems, Durkheimian arguments, and then looking at the role, obviously, of like functional utilitarian, which would be more the capitalist perspective, and micro-interactionist tradition. So it's a little bit very theoretical, but I'm interested in seeing how those lenses can be especially combined, especially in today's economy with digital transformation and COVID, and where there's been this really big pushback. And I think even in terms of transforming societies, and we don't know which way it's going to go per se. So be interested in seeing how people kind of lean in on those different lenses, and then beginning with capitalism.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Rachel?
Sorry about that. Hi. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. I am currently not teaching. I come from the secondary education and considering moving up. I finished my, actually some time ago, a long time ago, my MBA with an emphasis in management at Fordham University.
Thank you.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
And Ray?
Good morning, everybody. I'm just getting organized here. I'm a professor, retired from Northeastern University in the business school, and still teaching a course on climate leadership. And obviously, how you work with government and the economy is crucial to how we're going to address climate leadership. I have a book forthcoming entitled Lead for the Planet, 5 Practices for Confronting the Climate Crisis, which is published by the University of Toronto and attempts to summarize the different approaches we need to take to climate change. Yes, we need to understand the science, but yes, we need to also have effective ways of organizing, and that includes capitalist organizing to address it. So I'm very eager to hear what you have to say, and very much look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Shane.
Hello, my name is Shane. I am assistant professor of sport management at Indiana Tech, which is based out of Fort Wayne. I'm responsible for all of the sport management curriculum. I also have to teach and develop some of the general business curriculum as well. I'm expected to have some of that on my contract load all the time. So I've been told to do, you know, things like micro and macro, and that's always just absolute hell for those students. I always apologize to them that they're learning that from me as a sport person. But I actually address capitalism all the time. Sport is a product that shouldn't be a product. It's a heavily commodified, heavily consumer-based, profit-based industry in America, and it just shouldn't. I'm from Canada, so I'm always comparing socialism to capitalism. I grew up in a socialist-based country, so I'm frequently, every day, I don't understand, but then also totally understand why people do the things they do in this country. You know, I watch the news and I go, I can't even, why is that happening? And then I stop and go, oh, right, of course, duh. I totally understand that. So
Great.
I try and bring it up a lot, you know, like for me, I grew up in a country where sport shouldn't be, everyone should get some money. Everyone should get some money. Sport is a product that is important for national health, well-being, and wellness. So everyone should get some money. And then, but I'm in America where it's like, just not that way at all. And it's really important in my particular area that the students understand sport for development versus purely capitalistic pursuit of a sport product. So I like to try and get as much out of these types of conversations as possible. It always blows my mind how many students in my classes they grew up here. They don't know what capitalism is at all. And obviously they have no clue what socialism is, other than it's just the big bad devil that's going to open the portal to hell and all that good stuff. So looking forward to it.
Thank you very much. And Jim, I'm sorry if you were waiting long. Welcome. We're just going in and introducing ourselves. Do you mind? You have to unmute yourself.
I apologize for being late, and thank you for letting me in. We're talking about what we're doing about capitalism in class. Is that roughly?
Well, we're just introducing ourselves. If you want, yeah, that's great. If you have something you can say about that.
I'll try and be brief. I'm Jim Stoner. I'm from the Gabelli School of Business at Fordham University, and I wrap capitalism really in the neoliberal narrative. And what I'm starting to do in class, and what we're starting to do, is say that we're in a broken system, and business schools basically teach business as usual around the world, and that we have to stop doing that. We have a session on that tomorrow. And basically, what I'm saying is that we've been captured by the neoliberal narrative sponsored by the Koch brothers and the far right of the Republican Party, et cetera, and that business schools need to transform their curriculum to start teaching about a sustainable world and how we can live in a sustainable world. So that's briefly why I'm here.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for sharing, and it's great to hear your different takes on this, and to know that there are people out there who are paying attention to capitalism. As you'll see in my discussion, I think that just paying attention is the key issue. So let me go ahead and share my screen, I hope.
It takes a second to come through.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
So let's see. Sorry about that. Don't know why that's happening.
It wants to save.
We'll get there.
Wow. What a great slide. I know some of these people.
Okay.
They were my sophomore.
Oops. Okay, wait a second.
You're almost there, Sarah. It will come through.
Thank you. We were there. Now it's.
Are you recording the session? Is the session being recorded?
Yes.
Yes, in fact, I should have mentioned that. It is being recorded. Brenda, if so, I should definitely make that clear before we get started. So I think this is now going to work. Sorry. Thank you again for your patience. Okay, so this is how to talk about capitalism. My goals for this session are that we talk about capitalism. I think, one of my key points, and it's brought up in what I think it was perhaps Shane said is, and a number of you referred to, we don't talk about capitalism in this country, and absurdly, we don't talk about it in business schools either. So my goal is that we make a kind of symbolic stand about the importance of talking about capitalism in a business education conference, but more broadly that we expand that conversation out with our students and in our communities. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from and who you are. Well, we did the who you are part, so I'll tell you where I'm coming from. We're going to talk about the silence.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your screen yet.
Oh, you can't?
No, sorry.
Okay. Hold on.
I'm also a UMass alum, so that's and friends of Sarah, so that's why I felt like I could just jump in and interrupt her, and she'd forgive me.
Yes, I'm grateful for it, in fact.
You guys are everywhere, you UMass alums. My goodness.
You can't get rid of us, I know.
Okay, now can you see it?
Want to?
Yes.
Now you just go to your slide, one slide at a time, and you're home.
Now can you still see it?
Yay!
Yes.
Yay! Okay, so goals for the session, as I said, to talk about capitalism, and also, so that means us talking, not just me talking. Where I'm coming from, I'll tell you in just a minute, the silence, which was referred to about capitalism, and some thoughts about how problematic that is. And then the kind of meat and potatoes of the session is to share with you a way that I have been talking about capitalism in classes for the last 10 years or so. And in my own college, with actually younger students, and then in some places around the country. So I want to share those tools with you, and put them out there in the public domain for you to do with as you will, and hopefully you'll find ways that you can incorporate them or that they can be useful. So what I want to do is we're going to have two little group discussions. I want to have a discussion about what is capitalism. And then I want to talk about after I've explained the tools, I want to have you have a little conversation in a smaller group about how you might use them or what you think about them. And then I'll share with you more specific ways that I have used these tools in the classroom. And then we'll have some questions and suggestions. So any questions about the format before we get going? And please, everybody, either if you graduated from UMass or not, please jump in if something doesn't seem to be working. Okay. So where I'm from, these are pictures of students of mine holding up pieces of paper that say capitalism is ... and they have different words that they put there. Some of them were defiant and put phrases, but that's kind of one of my sort of favorite images of all these smiling faces. I've been teaching at CCSU since, 2006. And really it's over the last 10 years that in response to increasing alarm at how little students in the college were able to talk about capitalism, that I began to incorporate it more directly into my teaching. And that is partly a reflection of the fact that I came to this job later in life, got my PhD when I was raising my kids. And prior to that, I had worked largely in international development, community-based economic development, particularly in Nicaragua, where I spent about 10 years right out of college working eventually with the Sandinista government and agricultural cooperatives, but also municipal planning and trying to make that grassroots. So I don't come out of a corporate background. I don't even come out of a business background. I did along the way get a master's in economics. So my PhD dissertation was about money and was very much drew on economic thinking. So that's just to say that sort of two of the strongest strands of my own preparation for teaching are an appreciation of the challenges that people face in trying to meet the needs of their communities, their families, and their countries at the grassroots level, and an awareness that that often has to happen in opposition to business interests, but that there are principles drawn from business and management which can be very useful to people as they try and meet those challenges. So that's part of my background that made me sensitive to the fact that I was seeing students graduating with degrees in business who were unable to speak about the basic sort of structures and systems of capitalism. They didn't really understand what ownership was. They didn't really understand what the stock market was. I mean, even though they'd taken finance classes and maybe could do calculations about stock prices, they didn't really understand the system of capitalism, what the role of capital markets were, et cetera. So I began sort of over each semester, I'd kind of get a little more insight, and I began to develop this what is now my sort of this framework that I use. Along the way, so I use that as a sort of scaffolding usually in ethics and social issues classes, which is, unfortunately for me, it tends to be seniors. So I don't end up working with students afterwards, and I wish that were different. But we use it as a way to talk about a variety of issues, including things that were mentioned just now, like climate change, issues of inequality, of marketing, et cetera. I'll explain that more later. Along the way, I took some of my students into the local middle schools, and we used a version of this format with local middle schoolers, and that was very interesting. And in the last couple of years, I've started having my students conduct what I call capitalism conversations with their own friends and family. So at the end of the semester as a final project, they take the concepts that we've been working with and they go in, there's a kind of guided conversation which I introduce them to, but they are free to, adapt it to their particular people and needs. And they have conversations about how capitalism works in their communities, in their families. And these pictures were taken on one of the days when students were sharing those conversations with each other in small groups, and then we had larger group interactions. So I'm very much interested not in coming up with an academic theory of capitalism or even, well, I'm definitely not interested in an academic theory of capitalism. There's plenty of those, and that's not my expertise. What I really think I can bring to the table is tools, as I said, that can allow people to feel more comfortable talking about this very important system that plays such an important role in our lives. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. I think, perhaps helps to explain why I'm doing this, and maybe helps to illuminate sort of the ways that I'm doing it. In 2018, I had a sabbatical, my first sabbatical, and took the sort of framework of capitalism on the road, and I did this wonderful long trip around the country and stopped and worked with high schools and community colleges along the way in places as diverse as post-industrial Gary, Indiana, the Lakota Reservation in South Dakota, Watsonville, California, which is big fruit producing, and Indianola, Mississippi, and other places. And that led to me experimenting for the first time with creating a website and a blog, which then I got back and immediately had a series of serious health problems. So things kind of got stalled out there, but I am now looking to reinvigorate that. And in fact, I have a grant to go back to some of these places, which I'm trying to figure out how to do virtually in this new context. So these are some images from the blog. These are some of the groups of students that I was talking with. And what was kind of very exciting to me about doing this was that I sort of set out with a hypothesis that it was A, important, B, interesting, and C, possible to have conversations with young people about capitalism. And I often did it in places. This picture here is from Indianola, Mississippi. I did it in places where I was given maybe a 50-minute class period, perhaps 6 classes in a day. So I was in 50 minutes, I had to sort of introduce the basic framework and then encourage students to have conversations or draw pictures of their own capitalisms, their own experience of capitalism. And I will have to say, it was really astonished sort of that it in fact really worked. And so that's what's documented on the blog. And you know, it didn't always work perfectly, but it was really gratifying to see that in fact, even in a short period of time and with people who, you know, they didn't know me, I didn't know them, we were able to have these conversations. There's an image down here, a little image here. I had this vision that I would also set up a lemonade stand in random places, and I did in fact do it in several places. This one I think was in Hannibal, Missouri, where I sat across from a reproduction of the picket fence that, you know, that Tom Sawyer supposedly painted with a sign that said, "Talk to me about capitalism, free lemonade." And so that didn't get a lot of takers in that, but it made for some interesting experiences of trying to talk capitalism. So.
Wow.
So here is, we get to this point about the silence, you know, this shh, it's not just a silence, it's be quiet, don't talk about it. And, you know, one of the images that I used with students was this goldfish, and you of course are all familiar with that idea of being so much part of our world that we don't see it. Many of us use the word, we are familiar with the word, but fascinatingly to me, we really don't know what it means. We don't know actually what it is. We have, for some people, it's a kind of a symbolic marker, right? It either is a proxy for what's good, or interestingly, for democracy. And it's interesting to me, if you talk to people, you could try a little experiment. If you ask people around you, what is capitalism? Sometimes people will say it's democracy. So that's a pretty powerful equivalency that people are making. Sometimes it's almost a quasi-religion. So I mentioned that lemonade stand in Hannibal, Missouri, and an older couple walked by, and the man asked me if I'd had any takers, and I said, no, not many. And the woman read my sign, and it said, "Talk to me about capitalism." And she said, "We like capitalism." And I thought that was kind of interesting because it sort of reflected to me her assumption that if I wanted to talk about it, it meant that I was questioning it, that I was not accepting it. And so I think it's really interesting how capitalism as a word, as a concept, has become this kind of symbolic marker. And what makes it particularly interesting is that in other countries, that's not the case. So I worked in Dallas, Texas with a bunch of English as a second language adult learners, and there were Nepalese and Mexican students there in the group. And when I explained to them that people don't talk about capitalism in the United States, their reaction was really startled. They said, "Really?" And those of you who have spent time in other countries or read about the experience of other countries, you may be familiar that there are places around the world where people talk about capitalism and socialism and communism and different economic systems, you know, on the street corner, in the barber shop, in a bar, at the coffee shop. It's not it's considered part of being a regular citizen. It's not considered an academic discussion. It's not considered math. It's part of what the shared reality is, and people talk about it and share experiences of it and have opinions about it. So I think that underscores that in the United States, we do have a particular, it's not unique, I think plenty of other places are similar, but we do have a very strong set of, on the one hand, very strong opinions about capitalism. On the other hand, we don't talk about it, and we don't even often know what it is. And as I said earlier, this is even perhaps more alarming that it's in business schools. So when I was working with a professor at the Oglala Lakota College in South Dakota, I urged her to check for capitalism in the index of her textbook. And she said, wow, you're right, it's not there. And so I'm going to show you in the next slide, I'll show you an example of where it is. But it is generally, and I check periodically, it is generally not mentioned in our Introduction to Management textbooks, for example. A teacher who taught business education at Williston High School in North Dakota said, you know, come to think about it, I don't think we ever talked about capitalism when I studied business. And my students at CCSU, when I do sort of explain capitalism, as I will in a couple minutes, I've had a number of them over the years who say, oh, so that's how it works. And which is sort of alarming. Again, at the end of a 4 or 5, 6 year business education, they don't really have a sense of what this system is that they're embedded in and that business is embedded in. So I'm going to ask you to talk about the silence in a minute, but let me just, so this is, I just looked, as I was preparing for this presentation, I thought I better look at the most recent edition of an Introduction to Management textbook that I have to make sure that it doesn't talk about capitalism. And lo and behold, there is one reference in a 700-page Introduction to Management textbook, I'm not going to say which one, published in the last 3 years. There's one reference in the index, and here's that reference. It's in an early chapter. It's 2 sentences, 3 sentences. And then there's, again, interestingly, there's many more sentences about communism. So it's, oops, I think again, this is sort of a striking example of our attitude. On the one hand, it's capitalism as a system in the United States in which many of us feel quite invested. We tend to have very strong feelings, often very positive feelings about it. And yet we don't know what it is and we don't talk about it. So what I'd like to do now, I'll give you a chance to ask a question or two of me, but maybe more importantly, you should be talking to each other in small groups, and then we could come back together after the small group. What is this silence about? Should we talk more about capitalism? And why do you think we don't talk about it? I think that's another interesting, thing to explore. Again, my particular focus is on how we can do it, but I think it's interesting to talk about why we don't. So does anybody have any questions they want to ask me before we get into the smaller groups?
I just want to ask one really quick.
Yeah.
When I address the subject, I always try and start off by telling them I don't want to be negative about it.
Yes.
I don't want to talk about it in a negative way. I don't want people what you were just talking about with the example of the people who walked by and just made the assumption you wanted to complain about it.
Right.
Students seem to think once I bring it up in the syllabus, we're going to bash it for an hour. And right. I try and spend a lot of time saying there are parts of it that don't work. There are parts of it that absolutely do work. Nothing is perfect. It's complicated. It's complex and convoluted, but it's affecting you every single day of your life in ways you can't even comprehend. But I don't want to complain about it, and I don't want you to complain about it. So how do you address having the right attitude towards it? especially
I'm
with
real-
younger kids who
Yeah,
haven't even paid their taxes yet?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because it brings up a really important point. Those of us who have hung out in academia, we know that that in fact there are places on campus where people do talk about capitalism. Where you hear the word used, you're right, Shane, it tends to be associated with a negative analysis of capitalism. So one of the important sort of tenets of the teaching that I do is to not take a negative stance. What my goal is to create a kind of the most basic, and you'll see this framework is very simplified, the most basic presentation of its most basic flows as a way that people feel empowered to discuss their own experience of capitalism. So I'm not trying to promote a particular interpretation of what capitalism is or whether it is good or bad. I'm really trying to create a vocabulary, a conceptual vocabulary, and provide a space, create permission for students to discuss these things which they know very well. They don't know what capitalism is, but they know what work is. They know what pay is, for example. They know what the government is. You mentioned taxes. They know what taxes is. They have some sense of what profits are. They know these things. They don't know how they fit together. And I want them to be empowered, and this is, I should have emphasized this when I was talking earlier. I want my students in my classrooms, I want the students in the classrooms that I was visiting on my trip, I want them to feel empowered to evaluate capitalism from their own experience, on their own terms. So I come from a very strong popular education, for those of you who are familiar with popular education, from a popular education background, where people having the opportunity to consider their own experience and articulate and share is really key. So this is a really important point. I think we're going to come back to this a little bit later in the discussion. If you assume that if you take a negative approach and if you don't create a space where people can reflect on their own experience, you will shut down the conversation because of those sort of the stigma attached to conversations about capitalism, as you mentioned. And so on other parts of the campus, I taught when I was a graduate student, I taught at a liberal arts college near UMass. I will not name it, but I was in the mailroom one day and we shared the mailroom with other departments, and there was a sociology professor there, and I'd seen on his syllabus that he talked about Mondragon, which is a cooperative, some of you may be familiar, in Spain. And I said, oh, I saw you teach about Mondragon. I do too. And he said, well, I'm sure you teach about it in a different way. But it was an interesting comment because I think, as many of you are familiar, other parts of the campus, the sociology department, the political science department, sometimes the anthropology department, the social justice department, if there is such a thing, they will talk about capitalism often from an assumption that it is negative. And so the discourse takes on that flavor. And I think students are sensitive to that, and the general public is kind of sensitive to that. Did anybody else want to add anything to that?
Sarah, I would definitely agree with that. Like, I know that, I took several courses in schools of education, and they're very much tend to be flavored against capitalism.
Right.
In my personal experience of it. And
yeah.
I would say a lot of other people would probably agree with that as well.
And I think what's interesting, even they may say the word more than we do in the School of Business, but I think interestingly, if you ask even some of the professors who taught for example, in the School of Education and who talked about capitalism, many of them, again, as I said earlier, they would be using it as a proxy. The word becomes a proxy for things that they are against. They're against exploitation, they're against racism, they're against inequality, and capitalism becomes the proxy concept. So, yeah.
I find myself every year at Thanksgiving having to get online and talk about fighting with my friends about what capital, and they say of the big box stores and how buy from little people and whatever, and then I kind of go through the tax system and how you know, how much taxes and how many paychecks and things that those big box stores contribute to our, you know, our budget and our national budget and things like that. But I looked up, if you look up the definition of capitalism, it's really simple, and it's really anti what our government tends to do, even though they like to talk about it. So I like when you say they use it as a proxy. I think that's really on point.
Yeah, and I think, thank you. And I think it also, what you're describing also speaks to the fact, and this is really important, there is no one capitalism. And somebody earlier mentioned Adam Smith. I mean, Adam Smith, who's so often held up as sort of the patron saint of capitalism, in fact, as I think, I forget who it was who mentioned it, you know, he had a lot of concerns about how markets work, for example, and the effects of inequality, and, you know, excessive profits. There, you know, so there's a capitalism that was existed in Adam Smith's mind. There's a capitalism that we are living today in 2020, which is even different than the capitalism that existed in 1970 in the United States. And it's different than the capitalism that exists in Afghanistan in 2020. You know, there is no one capitalism. It's not gravity, right? It is, for those of you who use these concepts, it's socially constructed, and that shifts according to the time and the place, and the government and the president, and it also shifts. I mean, even within this group that we're creating today, there are different experiences of capitalism. It's not just that we, you know, some of us may earn more and some of us may earn less, although I'm sure that's the case, but we also have different experiences of the whole thing as a system. So let me break you up into groups and give you about, let's see, I'll check in about, you know, 8 minutes or so, and just want to give you a chance to talk to each other, because I know people have a lot of interesting things to say. So I'm just going to assign you to some groups of about 4 or 5, and I will check in a few minutes. And again, I want to just encourage you to talk about your experience of the silence. Is that in fact consistent with your experience, and your experience about having conversations, if you do, about capitalism in your classrooms or with other people? So here we go. So you should be invited to join a room. Thank you all for doing that. I hope you had, I heard some interesting snippets of conversation, so I hope you found that useful. I know there were a lot of questions raised that some of which I'll address in the next few minutes. This idea of the role of democracy, the idea of alternatives. One of the things that happens when we begin to start talking about capitalism is that we inherently are saying, if there is capitalism as an economic system, then, as the little excerpt from the textbook that I showed you a few minutes ago suggests, there are alternatives. And then the alternatives, I think, again, Shane describe them as being scary and awful. And so to say that there is that capitalism is a system suggests that there are multiple systems, which then requires us to evaluate, or suggest that we should evaluate. So just in terms of some of the ideas of the basic systems of capitalism, you know, as a system, one of the things I want to encourage people to talk about, how does it work, right? How does it work in the sort of macro basic concepts, and then how does it work in individual lives, that there are no one capitalism, right? There's many capitalisms. Donald Trump's capitalism is very different from the capitalism that my grandfather, who was a New England banker in the middle of the 20th century, advocated, right? There are very different capitalisms. It has to do with how do you live. The interesting thing, I think, is how do you live capitalism? It's not a religion, and well, even religions, right? We're supposed to live the religion. We have ideals, and then we try and live them. But capitalism is relevant to us in terms of how it's actually experienced. Who does what? Who gets what? I heard the discussion about power and resources. Why does it matter? What are the consequences of it? Why does it matter to our lives, to our communities, to democracy, to the world? Okay, so those are some of the questions. So I think what I'm going to do here is, let's see, stop sharing for a minute and use the whiteboard I gave you a little preview there, but so this is what I do with students, and we're trying to, and this happens over the course ideally of a semester, but sometimes 50 minutes, is to build the scaffolding from the ground up. And I put business in the center, and I think this is kind of comforting, reassuring to students that business is right there in the middle. And what I say business does is business creates value. Now, we could have a debate about that. Sometimes business creates anti-value, but business creates value is a principle that they are familiar with. And again, we're moving into a territory that people are anxious about, right? So business is, and I say that managers live and work in the middle of business. That's what they do as managers. They're learning to create value. So again, speaking to this issue of people's anxiety, this gives a positive role to managers and a positive role to business. But business doesn't operate in a vacuum. Business requires certain inputs and it produces certain results. So the value that it produces, the value that a business produces gets distributed in certain ways. And it gets distributed, for example, as pay.
Sarah, can you move that? Is that comfortable for you to move that closer? It's,
yes.
I
yes.
can't, maybe my eyes
Yeah.
are old, but I cannot read that.
Yeah, there.
Thank you.
Is that fair? And I'm also going to show you, I just wanted to show you how I do it sort of in a whiteboard setting, just as a less passive than a PowerPoint. So part of that value comes out in and is distributed as pay. Part of that value is distributed as profit. And part of that value is actually distributed as taxes. Now, these things go to people. They don't go into into the atmosphere. They go to people. So who do they go to? Well, they go to people who do work. A business needs, again, we're on very familiar territory. There's nothing exotic or sophisticated about this. You need people to go to work. And in a semester-long class, we actually do read a little bit of John Locke. We read a little bit of Marx. We read, other sort of this idea of, we kind of go back to feudalism, the idea that you are, as individuals, you can sell your labor. That's a radical idea in human history. And so we have, can you still see the, okay. And so we have, workers who go to work at a business and they get a paycheck. So the paycheck goes to workers. Then we also have, I use K because I'm an ex-economist. Oops. We have capital, which has to be invested, or money that has to be invested. So this is investment. And profit goes to the people who hold the capital. That's the capitalists. Again, kind of a scary term. If you start talking about capitalists, it seems inherently, but that is in fact what an investor is somebody who holds capital. And with students of all sorts, including people who are about to graduate with a degree in business, I have to underscore that capital is a special kind of money. Capital is not the money you have in your bank account to pay your rent. Capital is not the money in your jean pocket to go out on the weekend. Capital is a special kind of money that gets invested in order to make a profit. And then the other piece is government. And government, I have to have a conversation with students. What is it that government adds to this? And up until recent months, students were really challenged to think about what it is that government positively adds to the process of making value. But when we begin to, kind of tease it out, they begin to acknowledge that yes, roads are important, and police, that would be an interesting discussion these days. Police are important, and firefighters are important, and education is important. K through 12 is important. Et cetera. So they begin to, so that gets paid for by taxes. So now my diagram has gotten very messy. I'm going to take you to the pretty PowerPoint in a minute. There's a missing piece here that I put up here, which is democracy. And I draw this on a larger whiteboard as let's see. Oops, there's democracy. So I draw democracy as a kind of an umbrella over this entire system. And there we go. The idea is that business can only operate in the United States, for example. You can't, put up a grill in your driveway and start selling hamburgers. Well, actually, interestingly, now in the pandemic, some people are doing that. But you need to get permission to start a business. And you need to abide by certain regulations, which are set by the government. The government is people who do the functions on behalf of the democracy. So it's very compressed right now, but you have to have a conversation about democracy is all of us, and government is the instrument that we use in order to implement policies and regulations and priorities and spending, et cetera. The government gets funded by taxes. So let me just go back to the